Let's catch you up. Last week I cut a bunch of squares of plywood, attached a spiral staircase, did some hand tooly stuff on some nice red cedar, carved out my logo from my other side hustle, poured in some resin, and glued it all together to make these lovely dice towers. They took a long time. However, they weren't quite done yet, because while they rolled dice nicely, they need some dice trays to catch them. So that's what we're going to do this week. Continuing the Oregon and cedar theme, we cut down some side walls over on the saw stop, and then quickly routed out a rebate in the bottom that would accept a plywood base. I haven't got a Mitre sled set up on the table saw yet, so it was over to the Mitre station, and you can get these pretty accurate by doing a rough cut and then sneaking up very, very gently, and of course making sure your blade is at as close to 45 as you can get it. These trays would live in the top of the dice towers as a convenient storage solution. An elastic band helped me measure out the size of plywood that I needed for the middle, and I cut that to size. And you could almost stop here, that's a functional dice tray, but we're going to embellish it just a little bit. I've been watching too much Woodworking with Dash, and resorted to the blue tape clamp method to get my mitres rocking up all nicely. And I put the base in to keep it square, but to make sure the base came out again, I put packing tape over it so it wouldn't stick to the glue. This worked really well, and those corners came out quite nicely, but they are fairly weak. So with the slot cutting bit in the router table, I very, very gingerly used that to cut some spline holes. Just putting in the trays until they kissed the bearing would ensure it didn't blow through the inside of the tray. For splines, I got myself a piece of scrap cedar, used my hand plane to bring it down to exactly the right thickness, and then on the bench hook chopped them down into bite-sized pieces. Again, I think I like the contrast on the Oregon of the dark wood rather than the all cedar variety. Gluing those into place, and we could put the actual woodworking bit aside and try something fun and new. Well, I have done this once before on some bookmarks, but this is a much more appropriate use of the next technique. Leather. Believe it or not, this is Kangaroo leather scraps, which I kind of stole from my wife's leather making kit, but she'll never notice. Stabby McStabface to mark on out some squares just a bit bigger than the plywood, so I'd have some overlap. The rue leather is very thin, but it cuts nice and easily. Now I've seen Morley and Grant both make 3D printed stamps when they're doing leather work, but I don't have a 3D printer, so I'm going to have to make a wooden one. And that way I can transfer the same logo that's on the front of the dice tower from my gaming business onto this leather as an imprint. Well, that's the plan anyway. So I cut and rounded over some really thin pieces that would form the embossing part of my stamp, and luckily Carbotech were kind enough to send me this new digital angle finder that they've got in stock. You can check it out in the link below. And I used that to mark out the small pieces and cut my angles successfully. And then stopped because that was taking far too long, and I realised that the disc sander, dodgy as it is, was a much better solution. Once I had my pieces cut nicely, we could super glue those down to another backing board. And boom, one Zalgariath Gaming logo, well, most of it anyway. I soaked the leather for just a few minutes. This would soften it up and give the impression the best chance of transferring. I don't normally crank my bench clamps down this tight, but again, it was really thin leather and I wanted to make sure that I got a good press. I only had one go at this. 5 minutes later, we pulled it off, and I'll call it a success. A few little gaps in there from the wood, but you know, if you had a 3D printer, you could make really, really nice stamps. Me, I had to resort to getting a nail punch to do the final embellishments of the stars that go in the corner of the logo. Last time I did any leather work, I used polyurethane glue, and I'm doing the same here again today because it worked really well and that one hasn't fallen apart. It does get pretty slidey, so be careful when you're applying your clamping pressure. I left that overnight in my makeshift press, and then crossed my fingers that it wouldn't be stuck down to the melamine. And fortunately it wasn't, and came out beautiful. Look at that. Really, really nice. I'm glad I went to the effort. Trimmed the bases back down to size, and then ran the chamfering all the things over the edges so they'd fit back in the trays, but not just yet. The eagle-eyed among you may notice as I cut off the splines with a flush cut saw that there is an extra piece of wood glued in. The reason for that will become apparent in a second. I really should have just used a thicker piece of timber at the back, but it blended in quite nicely, and a few swipes with the number 5 low-angle jack plane brought it down to the level of the dice tray. You'll never know it was an afterthought, because it really, really was an afterthought. I really like that jack plane. Chamfer all the things because it's kind of compulsory at this stage. And then it was time for the scary bit. These have to sit against the dice towers, which have a circular opening, which doesn't have much clearance space underneath it. Not the best design in hindsight, but hey, I was making this up as I went along. So what I did was clamp both of the trays together, as I needed a half circle in each, and this would allow me to use the Forstner bit of appropriate size to cut most of the way through. Quietly pooped myself, hoping I didn't blow it out too badly, or that things exploded, or that I cut my leather, and I'm happy to report that none of those happened. The leather was fine, I got the depth perfectly good, no blowout, and I didn't go all the way through. I could then use a drum sander in the drill press to finesse the correct size. And then you just magnetize wood, right? Nah. Flashback to last week, and I can now explain why I embedded magnets underneath the rear side of the front of these dice towers, because I always had this magnetic attraction dice tray thing in mind. I thought this was really clever too, using doweling points in order to transfer the magnet holes from one side to another so that it would fit, and now you can see why I needed to add that thicker piece of timber in there, because for the dice tray to sit flush against the front of the tower, I needed to make room for those turrets on either side, and I had to cut in, and that was just going to be leaving it way too thin if I didn't add that extra piece of support. I won't show you how I did those little cut-ins because it was kind of dodgy on the router table, and we wouldn't want to be copying my bad habits. But the hidden magnets on the front of the tower just worked perfectly. I don't care if you can see them on the tray, as long as you can't see them on the front of the tower when it's packed away. Super happy. Beeswax coating for the leather, and then the same Danish oil that I used on the towers for the wooden parts of the tray. I love Danish oil, you can't mess it up, just put it on there, leave it for 10 minutes, wipe it off, repeat 3 or 4 times, happy days. My last paranoid moment was firstly gluing in the logo in the correct orientation, but also that polyurethane glue expands like nothing else, so I had to use the minimal amounts to make sure I didn't have any cleanup on the leather, which would have been impossible. I could clamp those up and they were nearly done. Oh look, Seb's here.
Hi, I'm Seb, and I make stuff.
I've recently binge-watched all of Seb Makes Stuff channel. If you're into nerdy stuff, not just D&D, but other Makin-style dioramas, tabletop, and related content, Star Wars, video games, Zelda, TV shows, all sorts of different bits and pieces. Super cool stuff, very talented guy, very good videography as well. You will enjoy it, go give him a subscription. And while we're supporting small Aussie makers, it was time to buy me some handcrafted dice from Die of the Beholder. These beautiful purple dice matching my Zalgariath gaming colours also glow under UV light. I just need to buy me a UV light. and they look super cool. Thanks, Bree. These are awesome. And they're getting their maiden run down the brand new dice tower. So I can roll with advantage. And here's how she works and what it was all for. Why just drop dice into a tray or onto a table when you can have them go clinkety clinkety clink down your dice tower and be caught in your beautiful embossed leather, debossed leather dice tray. And of course I had to keep on rolling until we got a crit. Don't be a mimic, don't be a mimic. Yeah, that's definitely not a mimic. Not a mimic at all. Dice bag. So the dice tray will work with lots of size dice, even these big chunky boys, and yes, you can just ignore the whole rolly tower thing and chuck them into the tray if you so wish, but where the hell's the fun in that? And the only thing better than the DM having a custom dice tower is your players also having a custom dice tower to roll at the other end of the table. When you're all done, the tray stores conveniently with or without your dice in the top and packs away for the next session. This has been James from Fixit Fingers. I hope you enjoyed this. Check out the dice tower build if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next one.